Welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Avoid Crisis Nightmares, Identify Gaps and Strengthen Your Response Plan. My name is Courtney, and I'll be your moderator. So let's get started. First, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Jenny Gregorczyk, Managing Partner at Apron, a food communication, PR, and marketing company. Jenny has 15 years of experience specializing in brand production with crisis communications and issues management, particularly in food safety, including risk analysis and crisis communication preparation. Next, I'd like to introduce Shireen Griffith, Operations Manager at Chez Vous, a marinated goat cheese and oil infusion company. Since 2015, Shireen has managed the operations team at Chez Vous, growing production revenue output 4 times. Finally, I'd like to introduce Holly Marcus, Senior Product Manager here at Alchemy. Holly has over 30 years of leadership experience in the food industry with companies such as Conagra, Kellogg, and Sara Lee, covering food safety, quality assurance, sanitation, and plant regulatory affairs. She is honored with the 2013 SQF Outstanding Achievement Award and was named the 2016 Food Logistics Champion. Welcome, Jenny, Shireen, and Holly. Today's webinar will cover the current media climate and what you need to know before, during, and after a crisis. Shireen will share how Chez Vous responded to a recent crisis and the lessons they learned along the way. We will then discuss how to prepare your organization for a crisis and how to improve your response plan. We'll also provide a few resources available to you and save time for Q&A at the end. With that, I'll hand it over to Jenny to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Courtney, and thanks everybody for joining today's webinar. There are a lot of pieces to responding to a crisis, and today I'm going to focus on the crisis communication side. And I know many of you on the webinar don't work directly in communications, but in my experience, it's really important and useful that everyone on the team has a clear understanding of each person's role in a crisis. Because crisis situations are not easy, stress levels are high, things are moving very quickly, so the more clarity that we can bring in advance of a crisis, the better. So to get us started, it's helpful to understand the media cycle that we're operating in today because it's changed a lot in the last few years, and the way we as communicators work has changed quite a bit too. Working in the media is a hard business, especially with digital and social media. It's just not a profitable space like it used to be. So media outlets are in fierce competition with one another, and the old phrase you may have heard, if it bleeds, it leads, is more true than ever. You may also hear about it as clickbait. And because it's so hard to make a profit in the news space, we're seeing a lot of syndicated content because it's less expensive than creating new content. So syndication is something that's happening pretty rapidly in the industry. And here's a funny example we'll take a look at from Conan on how news outlets share content across the country.
Now, a lot of people, they look at the news these days and they think the big news stories today are, well, the new al-Qaeda underwear bomb threat or where President Obama stands on gay marriage. People think those are the big stories. Well, judging by local news, there's an even bigger story that is sweeping the nation right now. Here's a look at today's real top story.
Thank you, Don. Well, we watch them on YouTube and post their pictures on Facebook. But is it time for dogs to have a social network of their own?
Is it time for dogs to have a social network of their own?
Is it time for dogs to have a social network of their own?
Is it time for dogs to have their own social network of their own?
Is it time for dogs to have a social network of their own?
Or is it time for dogs to have a social network of their own?
Is it time for dogs to have a social network of their own?
Is it time for dogs to have their own social network?
Is it time for dogs to have a special social networking site of their own?
Okay, you can see there that clip goes on for another few minutes, and that's a funny example, but imagine if that was a negative story about your brand that started in one market and went national very, very quickly. We also have to put ourselves in the shoes of a reporter today, and you can see from this diagram here, looking at the best and worst jobs, on the very bottom is broadcaster, and if you look just 2 clicks left, newspaper reporter is also on the list of worst jobs to have. And that's because they're not paid very well and they have to do a lot of work. In today's age, it's not just a matter of working on a weekly column or one story for the 5, 6, and 10 news. They have to do Facebook Live content or live tweet an event or create blog content. So they just simply don't have the time to really understand an issue, which makes it challenging for us in the issue space. And they're also in competition with who we refer to as citizen journalists. And that's really anyone with a cell phone and a social media account who can make news of their own today. So it's a really competitive landscape, especially with the rise of social media. Speed is the thing, sometimes in favor of accuracy, which again makes it challenging for us in the crisis space. But it's important for us to know the state of the media landscape so that we can plan against it. Okay, so let's talk about planning against it. But before we go too far, we'd like to start with a quick poll. How many of you on today's webinar have a crisis response plan in place? Okay, great. It looks like about 60% of you do have a crisis response plan in place, and about 30% said sort of, and that's great. Our goal today is to share some things that will help you build on that plan. And for those of you who don't have a plan in place yet, or maybe haven't completely finished your plan, that's okay too. That's why we're here. Let's talk a little bit more about the crisis communication plan itself. We always want to start with a plan on paper and then bring that to life. And here at Apron, we work with our clients to first identify the universe of potential scenarios that could impact their business from a crisis standpoint. Then we categorize those scenarios by level of threat to the organization and to brand reputation. And that's what you see here, level 1, 2, and 3, and what's included in each of those. And then from there, we draft messaging to have on hand for each scenario. It's much, much easier if we can start with something on paper in a crisis situation. Chances are it's never going to be the final copy that we use, but it's great to be able to start with something on paper. And messaging is really one of the most important parts of planning for a crisis. And we spend a lot of time working on messaging as communicators. And there are 3 principles that I often share with folks as they are working on their crisis communications plans, what the principles are to good messaging. And we'll talk through each of these 3 in more detail: consumer-friendly, responsive, and efficient. First up is consumer-friendly. And we tend in the food space to speak in a lot of technical jargon, mainly because there are so many regulatory requirements, especially with a food safety event. And of course, we have to abide by those, but we don't always have to sound like robots. And here's an example from Amy's Kitchen that has done a great job maintaining their brand voice and building consumer trust during an issue. If you look at some of the language that they use, it's very empathetic and conversational. They say, "We love cooking for you and appreciate the trust you place in our company. Rest assured, we've been in contact with the supplier and are approaching this matter with the urgency you would expect." It's language like this that is, one, on brand with what their consumers are used to hearing from them, but 2, it reinforces that they are really on top of this and doing a great job with a food safety challenge. They got a lot of great PR credit here for the way they handled this issue. And I think it's a great example of how we can continue to build trust in the face of a food safety issue. The second principle that we talk about a lot with messaging is responsiveness. And we live in an age where no comment just doesn't work anymore. But we can maintain some control in the brand narrative. And in fact, we actually developed a model for our media training program here called the predictive interviewing model, where we looked at a few thousand interviews to determine if there was in fact a predictable way that media ask questions in interviews. And it turns out, yes, there is a pattern. There are 7 question types, and we can prepare for how to respond to those questions in advance. And the third principle of messaging is efficiency. We live in an age of very short attention spans. We've already talked a little bit about just the speed of the news cycle, but here's a fun bit of trivia for you. The average attention span today of a goldfish is 12 seconds, but the average attention span of a human is measured at only 8 seconds. So goldfish have us beat by 4 seconds. And we see that in sound bites in the news. They actually match up very closely to that. There was a study done back in 1991 looking at the average length of a sound bite, and they found in 1991 that it was 8.9 seconds. We did a follow-up study a few years ago looking at newspaper headlines and quotes from 2012 to 2014 and found that the length of a soundbite hasn't really changed all that much over the last 30 years or so. It's still clocking in at right about 8.9, 8.95 seconds. So our messaging has to match up to that so that we're always delivering really strong sound bites, especially in a crisis situation, because a lot of times that's the only thing we'll get. We'll get one sound bite, so we want to make sure that the sound bite that we do get is really, really strong. A few other considerations as we're planning for a crisis. We've got a crisis plan in place. We've got some really strong messaging. What are some of the other things that we may not think about? First is just regular review of the messaging. A lot of times we write a crisis plan and we put it in a binder on the shelf and it stays there. But it's really important to dust it off regularly, a few times a year, to make sure, does the messaging still stick? And are there new scenarios that we need to be planning for? Also, an emergency contact tree is something that's really important to have on hand, a list of who needs to be notified and when and how you're going to reach them. You'll hear a little bit later when Shireen talks about an actual crisis situation where phones were out, and that presents a lot of challenges if phone is the primary way you communicate. Social and media monitoring during a crisis situation is really important. We want to know what the conversation is out there online and on social media about our brand. We use a few different tools here at Apron, and there's a lot of them out there at different price points. It doesn't have to be a really expensive tool that you use. And you can also monitor social media, especially directly through the platforms that you're on. But even just looking at the media stories online and what kind of conversation is happening there is really important. And it's good to have someone identified in advance who's going to run point on that. Which brings me to the next piece, the social media response policy. This is something I see that brands don't always talk about in advance of a crisis, but it's really important to know when you're going to engage with consumers on social media and online in a crisis situation. You know, a lot of times it may just be someone who is venting about an issue or they're upset, and maybe your decision is not to engage with them at that point. But if there are specific questions or there's misinformation being shared on social, then at what level do you engage and who is going to be the person that manages that for you? Thinking through that in advance is important to do. Next up is dark sites. So dark sites are dedicated sections either on your website or it can be a separate microsite where you can get information up very quickly. Your website is likely the first place that people are going to go for information. So it's important to have something in place to get information up quickly and have somebody designated to do that for you. This picture here is from Volto Creamery, who had a recall last year, and you can see in the top navigation of their website, they have a recall tab. And that is likely something that they had built in their site and just turned it on when they needed to. And with the content management systems that are used for websites today, that's very, very easy to do. So I would encourage you to take a look at your website and talk about it with your team. Next up is pop-up video sets and editing capability. We very rarely these days recommend press conferences for our clients, especially in crisis situations. because they're risky. It's hard to have control with a press conference, and they're really just not necessary, because instead we can shoot and package our own B-roll and share it with media. And this just gives media what they need. We know that they're already working on limited time and limited resources, so we can give them what they need, but do it in a really controlled environment. And here's a short example I'll show you of how Whole Foods Market has used this approach very successfully.
This morning, a rare mea culpa. The CEOs of one of the largest grocery store chains in the country speaking directly to consumers, apologizing.
Straight up, we made some mistakes. We want to own that.
Responding to that Consumer Affairs investigation, which accused 8 Whole Foods locations in New York of repeatedly overcharging customers for prepackaged foods, mislabeling weights, resulting in errors like these.
Yeah, we don't have to watch the whole clip for you to be able to see the 2 executives that were on camera. You may have noticed in the top of the video, it said courtesy Whole Foods Market. And that was a very quick video that they were able to shoot and send to stations, and they actually used. And it doesn't have to be high production value or something really expensive. You can even shoot pretty solid video on an iPhone these days. And you may have even seen a couple weeks ago with Southwest Airlines, they had a video up on social media and shared with reporters within just a couple hours of the issue that they were facing. So it can work really well for brands and doesn't have to be something that's really expensive or a big production. And the last piece is media training. I'm a big believer in media training because I think it's really important to practice your key messages regularly, because it feels a lot more comfortable in a crisis situation. So we recommend here that we do some kind of media training or crisis simulator activity with our clients at least once a year. You may have been through media training, but it's been a couple of years. I would encourage you to go back and go through it again and do some on-camera practice work, because it really helps with that comfort level in a crisis situation. Now that we are fully prepped for a crisis, we've got our plan and messaging in place, let's talk about what happens when we're actually in a crisis. And while we're all working towards the same objective, which is to move past the crisis as quickly as possible with as little damage as possible, we're coming at it from different angles. The food safety team, that goal is going to be to fix the problem. And they're asking questions like, have we identified the root cause? Have we isolated the issue? What corrective actions need to be taken in order for us to fix this problem? The crisis communications team goal is a little bit different, and that is to protect the brand at the same time. So we're asking questions like, what and how did this happen? What are we as a company going to do to make this right? How are we going to maintain brand trust from our consumers? How are we going to update them in real time? So we're asking some questions that are a little bit different beyond fixing the problem. And I think it's important to talk about that and understand why we're asking those questions, because otherwise it can be sometimes a frustration to the food safety team when they're trying to fix the issue and they have communications folks who are asking these questions that don't really have the context for why we're asking those questions. And knowing that, again, many of you are not directly in a communications role, I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about what we need during a crisis so that we can protect the brand and hopefully frustrate you as little as possible. So the first thing is just simply a seat at the table. Many times our job on the communication side is to serve as a translator, to take the food safety, more technical language that we may use in our HACCP plans and other places and translate that into something that is consumer friendly. So having a seat at the table really allows us to do that. And second, once we have that language, we need access for quick approvals from key personnel. We've talked a few times about how speed is really the thing, and so those quick approvals and access are important to accomplish that. And then third, we need a regular stream of information and updates just to keep our audiences informed. Think about the 5 W's that we use in the media: who, what, when, where, why. Those are the kind of details that we'll need. And then lastly, a forum to share back with you what we're hearing from consumers. A lot of times the communications team is monitoring social, we're monitoring media, so we know what the conversation is out there, and we can help provide some recommendations and talk about next steps. So those are some of the pain points I've run into in past situations. And again, I think understanding roles and planning as much in advance as we can really goes a long way to making a tough situation not be any tougher. Because again, being in a crisis situation is already a very stressful time. Okay, after a crisis, that means we made it through the crisis and we're done, right? Unfortunately, no. There is still more work to be done after a crisis. And in fact, we did some research recently just to find out how brands can get consumers to come back after a food safety event. And there were 3 significant takeaways worth talking about today. One, this idea of perception versus reality. We heard from consumers that they perceive brand attributes that include healthy, local, fresh, organic to be safer. Now, in reality, from a food safety standpoint, we know that that's actually the opposite. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between perception and reality here in the consumer's mind. And what does that mean for us? Well, if your brand is built around healthy, local, fresh, and organic attributes, then perhaps you're coming at this from an advantage if you have a crisis situation. If not, maybe you have to work a little bit harder. But important to know the consumer's mindset here. The second takeaway was that about 20% of respondents said, I'll probably come back to a brand or a product over time after they have a food safety issue. Great, that's 20%. 40% of respondents said, I probably wouldn't go back to a brand after they've had a food safety event. And that's not saying that if you have a recall, you're going to lose 40% of your audience overnight. It's just you're going to have to work a little bit harder to get those people back. And then another 40% said, you know, I could really be convinced to come back to a brand or a product after a food safety issue. And to me, that represents a big opportunity for us as communicators to build that brand trust again and get consumers to come back to a brand. And so last but not least, how do we get those 40% or even 100% of people to come back to a brand after a food safety issue? What respondents said loud and clear was that an apology is really table stakes at this point. What they're looking for is a much stronger response from a brand after the fact, really built around evidence from third-party experts. They really want that third-party credibility to help them feel good about going back to a brand. So that's something we can be thinking about today. If you were to have a food safety issue, who are those third-party experts that you could call on to help you rebuild that trust? So there's lots of work to do after a crisis is over, but I think the work that's done in advance of a crisis is the most important. We never want to start crisis communications with an actual crisis event. And we always approach it here at our shop as a not if, but when kind of mentality. And so having a solid plan is a really great place to start. But it's also the work that you and your teams do every day to build your brand reputation that is so important. We often refer to it as building a reservoir of goodwill. And I think Bluebell is a great example of how important that reservoir of goodwill can be. I don't think that there's another company out there that can go through a food safety event of that magnitude and bounce back so quickly, but they also had 100 years of goodwill built up that really went to work for them. We call it the halo effect a lot of times, and 99.9% of brands don't have that. I've never gotten to work with a brand that does have 100 years of goodwill, so it makes our job as crisis planners and crisis communicators all that much more important. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it over to Shireen now, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about her experience managing through an actual crisis situation.
Perfect. Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to start by saying I wish that we had talked before last fall. I thought it would have been really good information to have prior to a real crisis. Just a quick background, and we already talked about it. Shape was a manufacturer of marinated goat cheese, and we're in a small facility in Northern California. We've been in business for 2.5 years, and our facility is only about a year and a half old. Is your crisis plan enough? That is a big question. And thank you to Jenny, who did an excellent job of speaking about what happens before, during, and after a crisis and why it's important to have a crisis management plan in place. For startup companies like Chez Vous and young, inexperienced food companies, it can be daunting to determine how to write a crisis management plan. Where do we start? Are there templates? Which ones are better than others? It's a very broad subject, and it's also not clear how it should be tested to make sure it actually is enough. It's poll time. So let me please take a moment to ask you to think about your companies and your company crisis management plan and self-assess whether you think you would be ready for a crisis if it occurred tomorrow. All right, it looks like about half of you say maybe, some definitely say no, and then about a third of you say yeah, and that's all. That's really, really awesome. Thank you guys so much. So if I was taking this poll a year ago, I would have been in the yes category, because Chez Vous really prides itself on having the highest standards. For example, within 3 months of opening our facility, we were really proud that we achieved and maintained since then SQF Level 3 certifications. Part of that certification is to have a comprehensive crisis management plan. We've passed all of our regulatory audits, we review our plans annually. We're still small, so all the managers sit in the same room, and so we talk about this stuff on a pretty regular basis, and therefore, on paper and by every standard, Chez Vous we're ready. Bring it on. We're ready for any crisis. But we weren't ready for this. On the morning of October 9th, around 2 a.m., my phone started ringing with concerned friends telling me I should evacuate my family from my home, as there was, quote, probably some danger nearby. It was very vague at that time. The power was out and the sky was glowing red when I looked out of our window, and all the streets were full of cars evacuating the areas as well. As I drove away, there were flames visible in my rear view mirror, which was kind of scary. And the view that I was seeing was actually the fire racing to the location, which is seen in this photo. That was a Hilton hotel that used to stand less than 3 miles from my home, and it's about 10 miles south of the Chez Vous facility, just to kind of give you guys some perspective. So now let me walk you through the first 48 hours of this crisis, just from my own personal Shireen Griffith experience. So to start, on this screen is a visual of the magnitude of this fire event that we experienced, which are satellite images from MODIS on the evening of October 8th, and then the evening of October 9th. On the left, you can see has no smoke, not even a cloud in the sky. And on the right, less than 24 hours later, the entire region is covered in heavy smoke from the flames. The Chez Vous logos indicate where the Chez Vous facility is located, and the yellow star indicates where I live in Santa Rosa in relation to the facility. In total, there was a series of 3 large-scale fires that descended down on wine country in a very short amount of time. There was one to the north of Chez Vous, and there was 2 fires south of Chez Vous, so we were kind of surrounded. And in full transparency, my first priority was not the Chez Vous facility or our crisis management plan. It was my family. But when my family was removed from the danger, I then started to try and assess what was happening in the facility as well as my community. So the first priority and challenge was our employees. Many of them were evacuated as I was. And in addition, the staffing agencies we have contacts with were not available to account for the employees who were assigned to us because they were evacuated too. All in all, it took about 5 days to get full accountability of all of our employees. And what complicated matters for us is no Chez Vous employees live in the town that the facility is in, with exception of the CEO. All of us live south of Healdsburg, which is where the yellow stars are. That's roughly where everyone lives. And at this time, as it would be, the CEO and his family were actually out of town. So due to no employees living close to the facility, it was really challenging to get a true on-site status update. The fires had jumped over the highway and shut down all means of any of us driving north from where we all were evacuated to. We had no one who could really assess the plant in real time. The next challenge was getting accurate and updated information about the fires, and I think Jenny had just mentioned something about that. The local news and social media were helpful, though we found they were not often accurate. So what went right? Luckily, I have some connections with some employees at CAL FIRE who were able to send me texts that said, Healdsburg's good, Chez Vous should be okay. This was helpful, but it didn't provide details. I didn't know if all my raw materials or product was okay. Did we have power? Was there smoke damage? Was there damage from high winds? I just didn't know. However, I did have one small trick up my sleeve, which allowed me to give updates to my CEO and managers. We have a remote temperature monitoring system called Fireboard that connects to an app, which allows me to monitor my facility temperatures from any mobile device or computer in real time. So long as I was seeing readings, I knew that our facility not only had power, but the coolers were still operational. So all that yummy, yummy cheese was still good. And also we still had Wi-Fi service. So I could then conclude in theory that our product and raw materials were safe. Save the Shabu. I also communicated with the county, and they were able to tell me in real time when the highway and roads were open northbound, so I could finally go north and visually inspect the facility as soon as possible and do a site assessment. It was not until 3 days after the fire started that I forwarded our crisis management plan to the team and reminded them, yes, we have one, and we're going to be reviewing it. So we missed the mark full on, which I mean, it just was kind of in the moment. But I want to give you guys some takeaways that we learned kind of in the moment. Jenny did an awesome job, but this was just our experience. And she nailed it on the head. Number one, be sure you have an updated comprehensive contact list to include employees, suppliers, vendors, shareholders, stakeholders, board of directors, just everybody. Get a really good comprehensive list. And as she mentioned, also have a plan for communication when there are no cell phone service. We didn't have cell phone service probably for the first about 8 hours of the event, which was really, really hard to manage. Number two, go out into your community and find all the resources available to receive the best real-time information possible for that type of crisis event and practice using those resources. As I mentioned, social media, it was about as real-time as we could get, but it really didn't tell us. It told us people's point of view, not really what was happening. Third, just some really friendly advice. Review your insurance policies for all types of crises. There were many unfortunate business owners in Sonoma County that found out the hard and expensive way that their insurance policies didn't cover as much as they thought, and it ended up being a very costly lesson for them. Fourth, assess your crisis fairly. So Shavu, honestly, we assessed fire as low when we did our matrix and our assessment. And we all were absolutely certain that earthquake is going to be the biggest thing, natural disaster for us. And clearly we missed the mark on that one. So really assess your threats honestly. And fifth, work with other businesses within your community. See how they're writing their crisis management plan. For example, to improve communications, one of our local companies who suffered significant damage during the fires has since developed a really cool company-specific crisis management app, which has their up-to-date manual, evacuation route, total contact list, and a really neat check-in function, which once the app is launched into live crisis mode, it gives employees the option to check in as they are safe and can volunteer to help, or they're safe, but they're not going to volunteer, or no, I'm not safe and I actually need help. And from those options, the company can ensure their employees are accounted for or getting the help that they need. So work with other food companies. I mean, even reach out on other companies with LinkedIn or Alchemy or Apron. Just you grab ideas from others, and even webinars like this. So I want to say that Shavu is extremely lucky in the Sonoma County fires. Thank goodness none of our employees lost their homes and our facility stands fine today. If you take nothing else away from our story, please be sure to dig a little deeper into your plans and think if they are ready to take on a crisis that affects more than just your community, because some crises are a lot bigger than you. And I just want to thank you. And now Holly is going to take it away with Preparation is Key.
Oh, that was terrific. Thank you so much, Shireen, and thank you, Jenny. Great information. So let's talk about are you ready? In the course of my career in working in the food industry, I've gone through some different kinds of crises, everything from minor things like maybe it's a power outage, or maybe it's even just some broken equipment that puts production down. Some natural disasters like a flooding of a facility. Also worked with a facility that was actually damaged by a tornado, and we had some employees that were at home at the time, but they actually lost their homes and in some cases their lives. Maybe it was a man-made kind of a crisis, like a computer virus. It can be especially critical if all of your labels are tied up in your computer system because you're printing your labels in-house. You can't label anything. You can't access your formulas, which might be online. Or a couple of other major crises that I've lived to tell about. One was a threat of tampering that put a facility down for almost a full week worth of production. as well as a boiler explosion, which occurred during the middle of operations in an early afternoon on a very busy production day. I can tell you from experience that regardless of the preparation, even if you are in that camp where you think, yes, I'm fully prepared for a crisis, or if you're more critical of your plan or know that you have some gaps, or if you're just beginning to build your plan, you're always going to have a few aha moments. And those aha moments are actually what are going to take you to understand that there really are a couple of different parts to a crisis. So after I went through the boiler explosion, it was in a manufacturing facility located in a downtown area. Lots of shops and stores and lots of traffic. It, like I said, it occurred in the middle of a production day, very busy production day. All the lines were running, all the employees were there and in place. It was also in the Midwest in the middle of winter, and our high temperature that day was negative 11 degrees Fahrenheit. After the boiler exploded, the sprinkler system went off, which means that everyone was soaking wet. And a few seconds later, then the alarm went off that signaled everyone to evacuate the building. So once we got all the employees out and accounted for, well, they're soaking wet. It's minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit, standing in some cases in snow on icy sidewalks. Really hadn't thought about what would we do in this situation. We didn't have a place to take them. We didn't have a place for them to get warm. They left without their coats and their hats and their gloves and their boots. They had none of their personal items, and the building was not deemed to be safe, so they could not return. How do we get them warm? How do we get them dry? How do we get them home? And so on and so forth. So for us, the opportunity was that, you know what, we had practiced evacuating the building, but we hadn't looked at all of the what ifs. We hadn't considered all of the different scenarios that could occur. We kind of took it easy on ourselves. We said, oh yeah, we practiced. We did it on a spring day. It wasn't raining. It was nice outside. People got out, they got back in, and we could check that box. So there are opportunities. And you've got to look at everything that you do, whether it's a practice run or an actual event, as an opportunity to get better. So as you're looking at your practice events, or if you're actually going through a real event, keep in mind that you really need to focus on recovery from the very first minute. You want to make sure you come out the other end stronger and more capable and with an even better reputation, as Jenny talked about in her segment. You want to protect that reputation, and you also want to be able to strengthen it through an event like this. You always want to use everything you can as continuous improvement. And how do you continuously improve? Well, it's by teaching, it's by planning, and it's by practicing. The last place for pre-planning is when you are in the middle of an event. If you're in the middle of an event and you don't know what to do, it is just too late. There are always going to be nuances that you didn't plan for, but having the big things covered and having really looked very hard at the what ifs through teaching, through planning and practicing, you're going to get to a place where you can get through the unforeseen. If you don't know, the middle of an event is too late. All right, so preparedness. Well, when does it start? It starts on day one. It starts on the first day a new employee enters your facility. It starts on the first day of the event. It starts on the first day you are looking to recover. It starts on the day that you are doing your practice run. It's something that you need to embrace on a day-to-day basis. If you use teaching and training as a great, strong foundation, that will help in the preparation so that teaching, that knowledge you've exchanged, will then become action. Understand that those social influences are very powerful. You know, Jenny did a great job talking about the social media as well as regular mainstream media. I mean, I can tell you with our boiler explosion that the media, the local newspaper, television stations, and even radio had reporters at our facility before the fire department even arrived. And we had not talked with our employees at all about talking with reporters, or, we really had not considered anything along those lines. So understand that those social influences are powerful, and they can help that fake news become real news pretty darn easy. Practice, practice, practice. Don't ever stop practicing. It's critically important that you are your own worst critic, that as you practice, you measure what it is that you're achieving, and you find your gaps and fill them. That communication is key. Jenny talked about that as well. It's important to have a communication plan ready, but don't forget about all of your stakeholders. In the incident that I went through with a threat of tampering, we ended up sending all of our employees home, and we told them, please call in every evening to find out whether or not the facility will start up on the next day. And every day those employees called in, and we told them, no work tomorrow. No work tomorrow. Went on for almost a week, but we didn't give them any other information. So what happens then is they take to social media, and that's when the rumors and the innuendo, the suppositions, the personal opinions all start to come out. Those people were not able to come to work. They were not able to earn their paycheck. They were very, very concerned, and we weren't providing them good information. We were just telling them not to come to work. So make sure you consider your internal stakeholders as well as your external stakeholders. I think Shireen did a good job of talking about the list, your communication list. A comprehensive communication list is key, because it's not just your employees or the media you need to be concerned about. There are many, many others. Your suppliers, how do you let them know not to deliver raw materials to your facility if you don't have a good comprehensive contact list? Measure your effectiveness, whether you're in the middle of an event or you're doing some kind of preparation, a practice dry run. Measure the effectiveness, and then use that data so that you can continuously improve upon the system that you have. If you think just having a crisis management program in place that's in writing in a file folder someplace or in a spiral notebook is enough, I think Shireen did a great job of telling us that, that's not quite it. You really have to think about all the what ifs. You have to practice it, and you have to continuously adjust it based on the current events, based on changes to your organization, and so on and so forth. Remember, your future depends on it. Your brand's reputation, your employees' livelihood, meeting the needs of your customers and consumers. They're all depending on you to not only get through that event, but then to recover from it. As we said, know your way. And anytime there's a crisis, it's not a good thing. Have your plans put in place. And the one thing I'd like to just highlight here is that, especially if it's something that's intentional, if you have a disgruntled employee who perhaps tampers with your product, or if you have a threat of tampering, or if whatever it is that's been done is intentional, their goal is to see you fail, right? When customers don't purchase your products anymore, consumers don't purchase your products anymore, then you really don't have any reason to produce product. Your employees don't really have a reason then to come to work. Your suppliers don't need to supply you anymore, and therefore their employees don't need to come to work. And as people don't work, they don't make an income, they cannot support themselves, their families, or their communities. And it's a domino effect. So that's why I say, as you're going through these, keep in mind that recovery is key. Think about it from the first day and know the way through the crisis and into recovery. Now, I want to talk just briefly about learning. Learning is very, very important. We used to, back in the day, talk about the 70-20-10. That's the way that adults learn. Well, you know what? With social media, with information at your fingertips, we all live and die by our cell phones these days. Learning has really, really changed. So if you look at formal training, and that's where we sit down, we go through a group-based training session, we do e-learning, maybe it's a one-on-one, that is really providing about 43% of the learning that is done by adults today, along with that experiential. So it's taking what I've learned in this formal training class and then taking that learning and applying it out on the production floor, and then utilizing that on-the-job training. From there, then there's about a 14% that makes up the rest, which is more informal. So it's informal, like, hey, I'm looking at the guy working in the station next to me and seeing what he does, and if he does it that way, then I'm going to do it that way. Or I'm sitting in the lunchroom talking with my friends about what's the best route to take if I have to evacuate the building. That may be another way that I'm learning. But this really comprises how adults learn today. So let's just talk about if an alarm goes off. I know I've been in many facilities where an alarm will go off and all the employees will just stand there and look at each other. And they try and decide, is this the real thing? Is this a drill? Or is this just the alarm went off because, I don't know, because somebody accidentally bumped into the button? That's really, really telling. If an alarm goes off, those employees should be ready to leave that building right then and right there. I mean, I can tell you, working in a facility, we had a fire drill. It was just a drill. It was one of those where we evacuated. We got everyone out to the different points where they were supposed to muster or congregate as they evacuated the building. We went through and we accounted for all of the people within our different departments, but we were missing 2 people. And couldn't find where they were, because it was a drill and the fire department was actually there. The fire chief went back into the building with our plant manager, and lo and behold, we had 2 gentlemen sitting in the cafeteria all by themselves. They were eating their lunch because the drill occurred at lunchtime. So, you know, apparently they didn't get the message. We didn't train them. We didn't get the point across that if the alarm goes off, even if it's lunchtime, you do need to evacuate the building. So some things to think about. All right, so just very quickly, I'd like to recap what our speakers talked about today. And I think Shireen made a great point of the time to learn about crisis management is not when you're in the middle of an event. Really utilize that planning, that training, that preparation to get you where you need to be. Use testing often to strengthen and fortify. Think outside the box and consider all of those what ifs. So from there, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some available resources. Alchemy has some wonderful, wonderful employee engagement solutions that will help you with your crisis response. We have a multitude of multilingual crisis response courses. We also then have what we call communications modules for many of those courses. So not only do you teach your employees, you provide them the information, you test them on the information to make sure they've understood, but then you continually reinforce it using things like huddle guides, posters, digital signage, all of those things to help keep those important topics top of mind. We also have an app. It's an on-the-job app that you can use for continuous improvement. You can use it as a checklist as you're running your different crises practice runs. You can use this coaching app to capture the information. Did people do what they needed to do? And from there, then all of that documentation will help you stay ready for audits, and it will also help you track and trend your data so you can continuously improve your program. I'd also like to let you know that Alchemy does have a wonderful professional services department. Many, many years of experience working with the food industry. We have people who can come in and help you to test your crisis management system, take a look at what you're doing, help you to identify your gaps, and then help you to fill them from there.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Jenny, Shireen, and Holly for their time today. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us. With that, have a great rest of your day, and we hope you will join us again.